we resume our talk on the Cold War, picking up where we left off in Asia. The situation in China had become quite difficult in the wake of the collapse of the Qing dynasty. The nationalist movement in China had created several rebellions and then revolutions. We talked about the Boxer Rebellion and the role of the open door policy under President McKinley, Secretary Hay. But what had happened by the early 20th century was that China had been weakened by an attack from Japan, and ultimately they were in the midst of an emerging civil war between nationalist forces at the time under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek and the Communist Party under the leadership of ultimately Mao Zedong. And Japan decided to use that to their advantage. They invaded China in the early 1930s. You had the incident at Mukden, obviously the rape of Nanking. And so the Chinese communists decided to sort of take a hiatus from the Civil War, in a sense that they promised to work with Chiang's forces. In the end, Mao didn't very much work with the Nationalist Army, and he let Chiang's forces feel the brunt of the fight against Japan. But with the successful atom bombing, Japan was defeated and had signed the surrender. And almost immediately after, Mao then launched his attack on Chiang again, and this time Chiang's forces were outnumbered and overwhelmed by the communists, who had sort of been staging a slow development in the middle of the war. And so as 1949 progressed, it became clear that China would not be able to, that nationalist China would not be able to withstand an onslaught from the communists, and Mao and his supporters were victorious. Chiang Kai-shek's forces would, and he would flee to Taiwan, Formosa, creating the sort of controversial two Chinas that we have had to deal with since then. The idea of recognizing the People's Republic of China would take quite a while. Ultimately, that would be one of Richard Nixon's accomplishments. But in the meantime, the fact that apparently it seemed, at least from the American mindset, that overnight the United States had witnessed the world's most populous country become communist meant we were sort of losing the Cold War, and definitely Truman would be blamed for this, blamed for losing China. Obviously, it was a far more complicated reality than simply one American president losing it. But in the end, the nationalists had been unable to sort of solve the internal economic and political problems facing the Chinese common people, and Mao was successful at mobilizing them. But this certainly felt like a devastating setback in the Cold War, and it was really followed up with a 1-2 punch of having the news break pretty stunningly that the Soviet Union had tested an atom bomb. The American intelligence had sort of concluded that it would take the Russians several more years to develop an A-bomb. This proved to be incorrect. Between the use of German physicists that the Soviets captured, as well as the spying on the American Manhattan Project, the Russians were able to successfully test an A-bomb there in 1949 as well. These two sort of stories broke relatively close to each other, giving Truman sort of a real black eye, if you will, in terms of setback, and it looked like America was now going to be in an arms race with the Soviet Union, which of course, in terms of military, created a greater sense of both urgency and distress. In the meantime, in Asia, we see an interesting development in Japan. The Japanese had ultimately surrendered with one condition, and that would be that their emperor would be allowed to remain in power, Hirohito, and President Truman selected to be the sort of governor general of Japan to oversee the conquering enemy as General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur, of course, being a veteran of World War I, an American hero, and he was dispatched to Korea to oversee the redevelopment of their government, their infrastructure, their society. In all honesty, he set up shop in a fairly inconspicuous office building. He didn't travel around with an armed escort, and perhaps his most earliest generous behavior that he did was he treated Hirohito with dignity and respect. They met on a sort of neutral ground. Hirohito would be treated with honor, which the Japanese took great solace from. Also, in that in that winter at the end of World War II, winter of 45, 46, it appeared that the people in Japan would be short of food. MacArthur had already given a very, I think, important order that the American soldiers stationed in Japan not sort of loot the Japanese. They had to eat their own rations, not eat Japanese food. And during the winter, the Americans' rations were even used to feed the Japanese civilian population. And when he requested more food from the U.S. State Department, he gave them basically the condition: either send food or bullets, with the impression that there would be a rebellion. And very quickly, Japan recognized, it seemed to err their ways. They adopted a new constitution, they have a parliamentary government with a diet, a prime minister. They also have a interesting article in their constitution that outlawed offensive warfare. And they dedicated virtually none of their GDP in subsequent decades to military production. This would allow Japan to recover very quickly economically, sometimes called the Japanese miracle. And so MacArthur gets very high marks for his role as the sort of Mikado of Japan, and was treated with great respect by both the Japanese people and by history. Now, one thing that the American military and the American government and the Japanese civilian government did do, which is also noteworthy, is to create a civilian war crimes trial in the military tribunal of the war criminals of the Japanese government. And so they would place several major leaders, including Tojo, on trial, executing many, again, with the idea that human experimentation or brutal treatment of prisoners was antithetical to the values of both post-war world, but also to just humanity. And so with that, Asia seemed to be like it was going to be a mixed bag. Japan seemed to be progressing properly, as we saw, in the democratic mode. Unfortunately, it seemed that the Chinese were going in the opposite direction. So as a result of this new Soviet atom bomb and the Chinese direction in communism, President Truman felt he had no recourse but to go forward with the development of a new atomic weapon, and this would be the sort of extraordinarily devastating weapon of the hydrogen bomb. Now that there was an arms race afoot, we needed to have the next weapon, and this bomb would be 10 and hundreds of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I've attached some videos explaining the science of the hydrogen bomb to my channel if you're interested in watching that. But what it led to also was an emerging concern within U.S. general populace to some degree, but certainly within the armed forces leadership, of a concept called mutually assured destruction. The more we develop nuclear weapons, the more they would develop nuclear weapons and thus have more capability of destroying each other. This would be formally totally realized under the development of missiles in the next administration under President Eisenhower. Now, the Cold War turned hot first in Asia with the outbreak of conflict in North Korea. North Korea had been divided as a result of World War II, much like Eastern Europe, where the Soviet troops had remained against Japan and Northern Korea. They created a communist government. South Korea was democratic. And in 1950, the North Korean government launched a military attack on South Korea, ostensibly for the reunification of the Korean Peninsula. This was really the first test of President Truman fully of whether or not we would truly attempt to contain, as we perceive it, the spread of communism through aggression. President Truman moved very quickly to have a resolution introduced in the UN Security Council, the very new 3-year-old UN Security Council. For whatever reason, the Soviets abstained from voting in this Security Council resolution. China was still represented by the Nationalist China. And a result, you have a UN Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force in Korea to stop North Korean advance. At the time, General MacArthur was headquartered in Japan, and so both being an experienced military leader in the Pacific Theater as well as in history, he was assigned to be the head of UN forces. The United States would make up over 80% of the American forces that fought in the war. It is not considered a U.S. formal war. It was not a formal declaration by the American Congress, but it was a United Nations police action, and of course involved the death of millions of Koreans and tens of thousands of American military troops. The war progresses in a sort of a phase-like manner. If you check your slides, you'll see that initially the North Koreans made huge strides. They invaded southward towards the corner, southeast corner of Korea in the Pusan perimeter, it's sometimes called. From Pusan, MacArthur would launch a brilliant counterattack, considered one of the great military maneuvers in American history, military history, and that was a counterattack to the west and north of the North Korean force, excuse me, at a place called Incheon. But we'll resume the full outcome of the Korean War in a future episode. As far as the immediately recognized significance by history of the Korean War's outbreak is the authorization or the creation of a memorandum by the National Security Council, something else that was brand new, created in 1947. And the National Security Council created a memorandum. It's famously referred to as NSC 68. In NSC 68, you have a sort of extraordinary explanation of why it will be necessary for the United States to maintain military budgets at the tune of $50 billion a year. And it's about 13% of the GNP of the United States. So you're talking about a sizable military development and maintaining of a situation where we were capable of arming and being prepared to combat communism. NSC 68 fundamentally shifted the nature of the Cold War to a fully militarized conflict. It begins, I think, overwhelmingly the military-industrial complex. It allowed much of the economy of the 50s to be rooted in military spending, backing sort of the growth of the American economy, the rise of sort of the military-backed GDP of our country today, even. And ultimately, critics, would say that this is the sort of last major step to keeping the Cold War as a military conflict. So we'll continue with the Korean War and look at things like the Second Red Scare in our next video. Have a good day.